All right, so when we look at some behavioral characteristics and things to think about, when we talk about, remember when we did RTI, we talked about discrepancies. So we always look at their IQ, we look at their achievement. Um, Interestingly enough, students that have an emotional behavior disorder typically perform below their peers on those achievement tests. So we call it a dull normal IQ. So remember when we looked at the bell curve and 100 was right in the middle. So that's average. Average for somebody with an emotional behavior disorder is a 90 or less. So they sort of typically perform a little bit lower cognitively, and they perform lower on standardized tests. So like K-Prep or STAR or Terra Nova or MAPS or any of that kind of stuff. So something to think about. Not only are they going to be struggling emotionally or behaviorally in your class, but also probably academically. They go hand in hand. When you look at some behavioral characteristics, there's a lot of aggression or acting out. And aggression is a learned behavior, so I think that that's rather interesting. Also, immature or withdrawn behaviors or depression. This suicide should be in red because it's on your quiz. One thing that's very interesting are those that have mental health issues are very likely to commit suicide, and it's the leading cause of death in ages 15 to 24, which is just unbelievably so sad. And I would bet that those statistics continue to go up. So this book was updated in 2014, but I think that statistic is definitely staying steady, if not increasing. Conduct disorders is also a common problem. Aggression is a common problem. It's also viewed as a learned behavior. And then withdrawal and immaturity is typically due to an inadequate environment. So what that means is like, I don't know, when I taught in elementary school, they were still like first and second graders being carried in by their parents. Okay, that's unacceptable. They can walk, and you need to quit babying them. So a lot of times, if they're immature, it's because at home they're sort of being coddled to be that way. So something to think about. When we look at education, we need, first of all, to try to control their misbehaviors. And so a lot of times when a child has an emotional behavior disorder, they will have what we call a behavior intervention plan. So they do an FBA, and I'll try to explain this when we meet in person. They do a functional behavior assessment to see what behaviors need to be controlled, and then we find a behavior intervention plan to work on that behavior. The most important thing is that we're consistent in every environment. That we're doing the same thing to try to control that. So if the child gets angry and injures others, what are we doing to try to change his reaction? So rather than hitting or punching, can he do that's going to get his frustration out in a different way, and how can we control that when it happens? So typically there's a plan in place to help you and all the other professionals. Most districts have behavior intervention coaches that can come and help think about what those plans might be. The other thing is we cannot forget that these students struggle academically. So we need to continue to teach them academic skills and also teach them social skills. I mean, we don't teach social skills oftentimes, but we should, because a lot of times students need it. So think about that. And we need to balance controlling their behavior with academic learning. The importance is integrated services. And so we should all be working together to help this child succeed. When we look at strategies, we want to be systematic, and we want to use interventions that are based on data. So we shouldn't just be all of a sudden put this kid on a reward chart. You know, every day he has a good day, let's give him a point, and after so many points, he can have free time in the gym. There's no data based on that. So what interventions are you really doing to replace the behavior? If you're going to reward him for good behavior, are you teaching him how to have good behavior? Are you showing him which behaviors he's doing that are unacceptable? And if you're not, then you should be. So think about that. You want to continually assess and progress monitor. So we talk about RTI for academics. There should be something very similar for behavior, and you guys sort of checked that out during your RTI week when you went to RTI World, I think it's called. Provision and practice of new skills. What that means is that they haven't, if you're teaching them a new skill, you need to continue to teach, monitor, and practice that. If they do it once or twice, you cannot assume that they understand what they're doing. So go back and review it weekly until you know that they've mastered that skill. Make sure that your treatment matches the problem. So for example, if their issue is that they, when they're bored, or during a transition time, here's something that happens a lot during transition time. So you're done with your work, everybody go put your book in your cubby and or go back to your locker, put your science book away, get your social studies book. Or in high school when they're switching classes or something like that. During that transition, a lot of times there's behaviors. So if during the transition the kid typically, bothers another student, if that's the problem, then the treatment needs to match that, okay? So when you get up for a transition, you need to go directly to your locker, switch your books, and come directly back here. Or let me move your books in here so your transition stays within the classroom. Sometimes the child has difficulty with transitions, but the treatment for that is something like, so if you we're monitoring his behavior for completing his work on time. Okay, well that's not helping his behavior during transition. So just make sure that your reward and your treatments and your interventions are really matching the problem. What's going to help him get better during transitions. Multi-component treatment just means that you need to have several things that are going together to work on helping the child do better in his behavior. And then programming for transfer and maintenance. So if he's doing well in your room, so a lot of schools have what we call an EBD room or an EBD unit, and what that is it's like a self-contained or a resource room for children. And sometimes they do really well in a small group environment. They get to know and trust that teacher, but the second they go back to their gen ed class, bam, behaviors. So we need to think about treatments and programs that the child can do in the small classroom, as well as transfer it out to the gen ed class and maintain it throughout the day. And then we need to be committed to an intervention. If it's working, we still have to keep doing it because it is working, and so we need to continue those supports, because the second you take away the supports, it might fall again. So something to think about. The big trend is towards inclusion. So while I said there are some classrooms or some schools that might have an EBD unit or an EBD resource room, we want to try to keep them in the gen ed class as much as possible. Now there are times where, they're distracting others and they need to be pulled out, but the trend is towards inclusion. We want to keep them in the gen ed class, but of course there's going to be a requirement. There's, a lot of times there's a need for a different placement, but that doesn't mean that we can't try gen ed class first. We need to be thinking about instructional considerations. Are they grade levels below their peers? So once again, if they go to the gen ed class, maybe their behaviors are going to be okay until they start teaching Algebra 2. And this kid is still learning addition, and he's going to get frustrated, and then the behaviors are going to start. So not only do you need to think about the behaviors, but also the instruction. Is the instruction going to cause behaviors again? And if that's the case, then maybe a resource room would be better. We need to continue social skills. Does the child need social skills? What type of social skills do we need to teach them? A lot of juvenile delinquents, and that's in here as well, are often students who are academically behind, or they haven't been given the right interventions. And unfortunately, we're not always supporting them in the way that we should. So they just put that in here as something to think about. But ultimately, children with EBD do bring special challenges for us. And so we need to just always think about the buttons they are pushing and how can we try to accept their needs and support them in a way that's positive. One huge thing when it comes to discipline is that we have this sort of zero tolerance and manifestation termination laws, actually. And so zero tolerance is interesting. Zero tolerance are things that the school says, no matter what, we have a zero tolerance for that. So they might have a zero tolerance for, let's say, weapons, which of course they should. So like one day, one of my students had a pocket knife in his backpack, and he got expelled right there, or not expelled, sorry, suspended for the day. The second they found it, he was suspended for like 3 days. Most districts have like sort of a graphic organizer that says, if this, then this. So like if you bring a knife, you have to be suspended for 2 days. Or if you bring a weapon, you have to have this. And it's 0 tolerance, no questions asked, see you later, come back another day. What happened was he had divorced parents, and so he was at his dad's house, and they went hunting, or they went walking, and they went out in the woods, and he wanted to bring his pocket knife in case he found something. I don't know. He was a country boy, so he had it in his backpack to bring back to his mom's house, and to him, like, he didn't think anything of it, but him being a little boy showed his friend in class, and so immediately it meant he needed to be suspended, which is just unfortunate, but that's a 0 tolerance policy. There's no question like, why did you bring this? Oh, I can see exactly why that happened. Let me keep this in the office and your mom can come pick it up at her convenience. It was not like that. It was, sorry, this is 0 tolerance and you're suspended for 3 days. So anyways, manifestation determination is where a child with a disability cannot be punished if the behavior is due to their disability. So if something happens and it's a characteristic of their disability, they can't be punished to the same rate as their peers. And that's only fair. It's like saying that somebody who has a physical disability, let's say who's in a wheelchair, can't pass their PE because they can't run a mile. Well, they're never going to be able to run a mile because they physically can't run a mile. So just like somebody that has an emotional behavior disorder, they're going to have behaviors because that is part of their disability. And so we can't punish them at the same way that we might punish their peer. Of course, there should be consequences. Don't get me wrong. Don't understand that wrong. But we have to consider lots of circumstances when somebody with a behavior disorder does something that might deem a consequence. I talked about this earlier. Functional behavior assessment is sort of where we look at what some of the issues are with a child and then determine intervention. So here's the support for it. It's a positive behavior intervention plan. And then PBIS we talked about during RTI week. That's used oftentimes to just support behavior throughout the classroom. Sometimes we do need an alternate educational setting. And so, for example, I worked with a second grader actually who was sent down to Louisville, and I think it's Our Lady of Peace, I want to say, but sometimes there are institutions, medical or mental institutions that will take children and try to work on their medication and even out their medication, especially those that might be bipolar or psychotic, you might want to say, and they work on getting them to be safe for themselves because sometimes people self-harm, and ultimately so they go to a alternate educational setting, you might want to say, or a medical facility to work on their psychosis until they are ready to enter back into the classroom. Ultimately, it's not really clear how successful they are. When you assess their assess their process, or progress, you always want to look at their personal skills, their study skills, their motivation. There's direct observations, there's teacher rating scales. A lot of this we talked about in RTI. We just always want to progress monitor how we're doing and how the student is doing. Early intervention is best for every disability. The problem is it's really difficult to identify at an early age most behavior disorders. So we miss a lot of that early intervention, but we can help prevent some of it by allowing teachers and parents to understand ways to manage inappropriate behavior. Because a lot of the times children will meet our expectations. And so if we have consistent expectations for children, a lot of times they will meet it. And if they can't meet it, that should be a red flag. There's a disability. There's also this whole stigma thing, especially for those who are from diverse cultures. So Black males are often over-identified in terms of having an emotional behavior disorder. And so it's really difficult to qualify a student because there's that stigma that if they have an emotional behavior disorder, they're a bad kid, ultimately. And that's not true. It's that oftentimes they can't moderate their behaviors themselves, and so that's why it's a disability. They have a hard time monitoring those behaviors. Children will often not grow out of them. Typically, it's a neurological disorder in the way that things are going on, and then there's an ignorance about early signs. So a lot of times we just don't assume that that's happening, even though it might be. And then when we transition to adulthood, I'm going to run out of time, so that's okay. It's our last slide, or yeah, close to the end. There are programs available, so we just need to make sure that we're supporting that child at the end of high school and giving him productive options as an adult. And just some quick things. They might require intervention throughout life. If they're incarcerated, it doesn't mean that we need to stop giving them interventions. We still need to support them in the prison system, but we often don't. And then we need to also support the families in these situations as well as the students. So I just went over that